ganz, ganz herzlich willkommen. Wie immer sind wir alle, also das Team, das hier zusammen diese Lectures vorbereitet hat und bis in den letzten Minuten alles getan hat, um das hier möglich zu machen. Wir sind immer irgendwie nervös am Tag und vor allem zunehmend natürlich auf die Lectures hin. Und wir waren diesmal ganz besonders nervös, weil wir dachten, also Deutschland gegen Ungarn und ein Fußballspiel parallel zu diesen Veranstaltungen, das kann doch eigentlich nichts werden. Und es haben auch einige Menschen, denen wir normalerweise vertrauen, gesagt, ihr spinnt doch, das könnt ihr doch nicht machen. Wer soll denn da eigentlich kommen? Wenn ich mich hier so umgucke, dann bin ich wirklich sehr, sehr glücklich, dass diese Prophezeiungen nicht eingetroffen haben. Früher hieß es ja immer Sozialismus oder Barbarei. Heute ist es Sozialismus oder Fußball. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass jedenfalls alle, die heute hier anwesend sind, sich für den Sozialismus entschieden haben und für unsere Lectures entschieden haben. Insofern ja einen ganz, ganz wunderbaren Abend wünsche ich Ihnen und ein sehr herzliches Willkommen. Ich bin Rahel Jaeggi, ich bin gemeinsam mit Robin Zelikatis die Direktorin des Centers for Social Critique hier an der Humboldt-Universität in Berlin, das jetzt schon zum 5. Mal diese Lectures ausrichtet. Es ist ganz großartig, dass wir zum 2. Mal jetzt hier in diesem fantastischen Auditorium sein dürfen. Das ist immer eine ganz, ganz besondere Freude und ja, wie Sie sehen, einfach ein ikonischer Ort, ein ikonisches Auditorium. Insofern möchte ich ganz zuerst mich herzlich bedanken beim Intendanten und Chefkurator des Hauses der Kulturen der Welt, Professor Dr. Bonaventure de Kung. Und ja, wir freuen uns wirklich sehr, dass wir das hier wieder veranstalten können. Und wie gesagt, das vor dieser harten Konkurrenz. Vielleicht sind Sie auch gar nicht alle erklärte Nicht-Fußballfans, sondern sind einfach nur Optimisten und denken sich, die Deutschen werden noch so viel spielen innerhalb dieser Meisterschaft, dass wir da gar kein Problem haben werden. Ich möchte jetzt als erstes mal, bevor ich dann kurz einführen werde, möchte ich gerne die Präsidentin der Humboldt-Universität, die ich natürlich ganz herzlich hier begrüßen möchte, bitten, das Grußwort und die Eröffnung der diesjährigen Benjamin Lectures zu halten. Frau Präsidentin, es ist mir eine sehr große Ehre, dass Sie heute hier bei uns sind und uns hier begrüßen. Das alles in Zeiten, die doch sehr dicht gedrängt an Terminen und Aufregungen auch für Sie sind.
Sehr geehrte Lea Ypi, sehr geehrte liebe Frau Jaeggi, meine Damen und Herren, ich bin beeindruckt, wie voll dieses Auditorium ist und es ist mir eine besondere Freude, Sie zur diesjährigen Walter Benjamin Lecture begrüßen zu dürfen. Diese Vorlesungsreihe, 3 Vorträge, heißen ja nicht nach Walter Benjamin, weil sie sich seinem Denken und seinen Überlegungen widmen, sondern sie heißen so, weil sie vielleicht in einer Art vergleichbarem Geist, wenn ich das so sagen darf, mit philosophischen, mit aktuellen Themen, mit Gegenwartsdiagnose beschäftigen, weil sie diesem Thema der Gegenwartsdiagnose eben verpflichtet sind. Frau Jaeggi hat es schon erwähnt, die Vorlesungen werden veranstaltet vom Center for Social Critique, das wir an der Humboldt-Universität beheimaten dürfen mit großzügiger Unterstützung der New Institute Foundation. Und es ist ganz wunderbar, dass diese Stiftung uns die Möglichkeit gibt, nicht nur diese Lectures auszurichten, bereits das 5. Mal, also nach Charles Taylor 2019, Axel Honneth, Nancy Fraser, Sally Hesslinger haben wir jetzt das Glück und die Freude, Sie zu hören, Frau Ypi, sondern das Glück auch, dass diese Stiftung es ermöglicht, wirklich einen Freiraum zu schaffen. Einen Freiraum, in dem gedacht werden darf, ohne unmittelbaren Nutzen, aber natürlich mit größter Relevanz. Sie wissen, diese Freiräume werden an den Universitäten auch in Zeiten knapper werdender öffentlicher Kassen und kritischer Abgeordneter, die fragen, wofür denn die öffentlichen Mittel verwendet werden, werden diese Freiräume umso wertvoller. Und insofern sind wir dankbar, dass wir hier diesen Freiraum haben dürfen. Und ich als Präsidentin bin natürlich besonders froh darüber zu sehen, wie produktiv in intellektueller Hinsicht dieser Freiraum genutzt wird. Und dass der Anspruch mit diesem Center, mit philosophischen Themen und Fragestellungen und Vorträgen ein großes, breites Publikum zu erreichen, sogar an einem solchen Abend möglich ist. In Konkurrenz zu dem schon genannten Fußballspiel Deutschland-Ungarn. Ich spekuliere jetzt nicht, warum Sie hier sind, ob Sie sich sagen, lieber eine halbe Stunde Vortrag oder längeren Vortrag, konzentriert Philosophie, eine spannende Diskussion und dann ein Fußballspiel vielleicht in der 5-minütigen Zusammenfassung. Vielleicht ist das ja Ihre Abwägung, dass Sie denken, ach, 5 Minuten Zusammenfassung mit den Ergebnissen reicht, während ja dem Denken, den Gedanken wir folgen wollen in ganzer Intensität und in der Art, wie sie entwickelt werden. Und hier sind Sie ja auch nicht nur Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, Sie können nachher Fragen stellen, Sie können in die Diskussion gehen und die Tore, wie gesagt, kann man sich hinterher noch anschauen. Ja, das Thema moralischer Sozialismus. Und ich habe ein längeres Interview mit Ihnen gelesen, Frau Ypi, in dem Sie selbst darüber reflektiert haben, was es eigentlich heißt, dass Sie sich jetzt der Tradition des Sozialismus zuwenden, dass Sie bestimmte Gedanken wieder aufgreifen, bei denen sich auch vielleicht mancher hier im Raum mal gefragt hat, ist es noch aktuell, was sagt uns das? Und ich bin sehr gespannt, welche Gedanken Sie zum moralischen Sozialismus entwickeln werden, schon entwickelt haben, uns mitgebracht haben. Ja, einem breiteren Publikum sind Sie sicherlich noch bekannter durch Ihr Buch Freiheit. Und ich habe jetzt leider nur die englische Ausgabe, den Schluss dabei mitgebracht, aber da waren mir doch ein paar Sätze drin, die ich hier vorlesen möchte, weil ich sie gerade in dieser Zeit in unserer gesellschaftlichen Situation so wichtig finde. Also jetzt ein bisschen englische Zitat aus Ihrem Buch. My family equated socialism with denial. The denial of who they wanted to be, of the right to make mistakes and learn from them, to explore the world on one's own terms. I equated liberalism with broken promises, the destruction of solidarity, the right to inherit privilege, turning a blind eye to injustice. In some ways, I have gone full circle. When you see a system change, it's not that difficult to believe that it can change again. Fighting cynicism and political apathy turns into what some might call a moral duty. To me, it is more of a debt that I feel I owe to all the people of the past who sacrificed everything because they were not apathetic. They were not cynical. They did not believe that things fall into place if you just let them take their course. If I do nothing, their efforts will have been wasted. Their lives will have been meaningless. Und ich glaube, diese Worte sind für uns ein guter Ansporn und eine Ermahnung, uns klarzumachen, dass gerade wenn wir auf die politische Situation in Deutschland und in Europa schauen, wenn wir auf die Erfolge der extremen Rechte in den Wahlen schauen, in Deutschland, in Frankreich, in anderen Ländern, wenn wir auf den wachsenden Antisemitismus in unserem Land schauen, wenn wir schauen, wie sehr Demokratie in Frage gestellt wird, ich glaube, dann ist es wichtig, sich klarzumachen, dass es an uns ist, die Empathie nicht zu verlieren, den Blick für die Freiheit und für die Demokratie nicht zu verlieren und an dem Platz, an dem wir stehen, das zu tun, von dem wir denken, dass es richtig ist und unsere Gesellschaft in die richtige Richtung entwickeln. Ich freue mich sehr auf Ihre Überlegungen zum moralischen Sozialismus und ich wünsche uns allen einen inspirierenden, anregenden Abend.
Ja, ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank, Frau von Blumenthal. Und natürlich ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank, Lea, dass du unserer Einladung hier gefolgt bist. Frau von Blumenthal hat es ja schon erwähnt, es gibt viele gute Gründe, heute Abend hier zu sein. Der eindeutig beste darunter ist Lea Ypi. Lea Ypi, und auch das wurde gerade schon erwähnt, ist ja eben nicht einfach nur Philosophin, also Professorin für politische Theorie an der London School of Economics, sondern, und das ist in unserer Zunft schon ein bisschen eine Besonderheit, sie ist gleichzeitig auch Autorin, ist dem breiten Publikum tatsächlich durch das von Frau von Blumenthal erwähnte Buch Frei bekannt geworden, und in diesem Buch beschreibt sie ihre Kindheit im sozialistischen Albanien. Sie beschreibt vor allem aber auch eben eine Zeit von Transformation, und es ist unter anderem deshalb ein so faszinierendes Buch, für ganz verschiedene Menschen, weil sie gleichzeitig und verflochten mit diesen autobiografischen Erzählungen einen Begriff verhandelt, der in der Philosophie sehr zentral ist, nämlich der Begriff der Freiheit. Was Freiheit ist, wie es sich anfühlt, wenn sie fehlt, wie Freiheit dann aber auch wieder verraten und verkauft werden kann, selbst nach einer Transformation, die im Namen der Freiheit vonstatten gegangen ist, also während der von ihr beschriebenen Schocktherapie, die Albanien nach dem Sturz des sozialistischen Regimes in gewisser Hinsicht verordnet worden ist. Das sind Fragen, die Lea Ypi bis heute beschäftigen. Sie tut das, sie beschäftigt sich damit auf eine ausgesprochen philosophische Weise, denn Lea Ypi ist in ihrem philosophischen Leben eine herausragende Kant-Expertin. Und zwar auch hier wiederum mit der Besonderheit, dass sie eine Kant-Expertin ist, die sich vor allem auch für jene Stellen des Kantschen Werks interessiert, in der viel zitierte, selten beachtete kategorische Imperativ mit Leben gefüllt wird und wo sich politische Konsequenzen aus dem kategorischen Imperativ abzeichnen. Philosophie ist also, und das merken alle, die Lea Ypi kennen, wir hatten ja das Vergnügen, dass wir schon die letzten Wochen, als sie zu Gast bei uns am Center war, schon in regen Austausch, in regen Diskussionen mit ihr gestanden sind. Philosophie ist für Lea eine ausgesprochen lebendige Angelegenheit, eine Angelegenheit, in der es aus den Eiswüsten der Abstraktion heraus dann dennoch um die brisanten gesellschaftlichen Fragen der Zeit und der Zukunft geht. Insofern war das, glaube ich, wirklich ich kann es nicht anders sagen, es war eine wirklich ganz großartige Wahl und es ist eine großartige Fügung, dass Lea Ypi das möglich machen konnte, in diesem Jahr hier mit uns zu sein. Es ist auch ein wunderbares Passungsverhältnis, dass sie das Thema moralischer Sozialismus gewählt hat. Also, damit wir uns richtig verstehen, wir schreiben unseren Benjamin Chairs und Lecturern ja nicht die Themen vor, sondern wir lassen sie oder wir überlegen zusammen mit ihnen und lassen sie wählen, was sie machen wollen. Und der Umstand, dass Lea Ypi jetzt genau heute und hier dieses Thema gewählt hat, ist natürlich in verschiedenen Hinsichten besonders großartig für uns. Vor 5 Jahren nämlich hatten wir zu einem allerersten Diskussionsabend mit dem Titel Über Sozialismus reden auch schon einmal Lea Ypi eingeladen. Das war in einer Zeit, in der das Wort Socialism in aller Munde war, weil damit unter anderem in den USA und auch in Großbritannien Wahlkämpfe geführt worden sind. Dass das alles nicht so gut ausgegangen ist, wissen wir. Es ging uns auch damals schon nicht etwa darum, den alten real existierenden Sozialismus wieder aufleben zu lassen, sondern um die Frage danach, wie eigentlich eine demokratischere Gesellschaft, eine Gesellschaft, die aus den ökonomischen und sozialen Krisen und Verwerfungen herausführen kann, wie das eigentlich aussehen soll. Und ich glaube, ganz im Geist dessen, was Lea Ypi uns in den nächsten 3 Tagen hier entwickeln wird, ging es uns darum, den alten CSU-Slogan Freiheit oder Sozialismus sozusagen zu widerlegen und die Frage aufzubringen, wie man eigentlich Freiheit und Sozialismus oder vielleicht sogar Freiheit so verstehen kann, dass sie, und das sind Überlegungen, die Sie in den nächsten Tagen sicherlich in aller Ausdifferenziertheit hören werden, wie man Sozialismus so verstehen kann, dass er Freiheit überhaupt erst gesellschaftlich ermöglicht. Der Sozialismus, den Lea Ypi hier vorhat, ist einer, der genau dadurch moralisch wird, wenn Sie sich fragen, warum moralischer Sozialismus, dass er eben dem der Verwirklichung von Freiheit verpflichtet ist. Warum Sozialismus als Begriff? Man könnte sagen, naja, da gibt es auch mittlerweile ein paar andere Begriffe, die nicht so viel historische Altlasten haben, aber unter anderem auch dafür ist Lea Ypi hier genau die richtige Person, nämlich sich vor diesen Altlasten und vor der historischen Erfahrung des Sozialismus nicht einfach wegzuducken, sondern sie in die Überlegungen mit aufzunehmen und unter diesem Titel wieder und noch einmal über eine andere und vielleicht also über eine moralisch-sozialistische Gesellschaft nachzudenken. An den kommenden 3 Abenden wird also Lea, Sie kennen das schon, diejenigen, die schon häufiger hier bei den Benjamin Lectures waren, es ist ja tatsächlich eine aufeinander aufbauende Reihe von Vorträgen und Leas Gliederung, Einteilung dieser Vorträge folgt in diesem Fall den berühmten Fragen Kants. Ich könnte jetzt behaupten, dass wir auch zum Kant ja das natürlich extra so ausgewählt haben. Das stimmt nicht ganz, aber hat sich anders als die Sache mit der Europameisterschaft ganz gut gefügt. Heute Abend also soll es um die Frage, was kann ich wissen, gehen. Morgen wird es um die Frage, was soll ich tun, gehen. Und am Freitag dann um die Frage, was darf ich hoffen. Die Lectures selber werden auf Englisch sein. Wir haben jetzt die Einführung auch unter anderem deshalb auf Deutsch gemacht, weil es hier vielleicht einige gibt, die nicht oder nicht so fließend Englisch verstehen und die wir hiermit nochmal darauf hinweisen möchten, dass es eine Übersetzung gibt, eine Simultanübersetzung ins Deutsche und dass Sie, falls Sie noch nicht im Besitz des Senders und der Kopfhörer sind, können Sie sich diese draußen im Foyer noch holen. Lea Ypi versteht sehr gut Deutsch, sie spricht auch sehr gut Deutsch. Insofern werden wir in der auf den Vortrag folgenden Diskussion und Q&A-Sitzung sind Sie ganz herzlich dazu eingeladen, Ihre Fragen auch auf Deutsch zu stellen. Das ist gar kein Problem. Lea versteht das oder im Zweifelsfall gibt es dann eine spontane Flüsterübersetzung noch dazu. Also scheuen Sie sich nicht, Fragen zu stellen. Damit bin ich auch schon bei dem weiteren Ablauf. Es wird hier 2 Mikrofone im Saal geben, an denen Sie sich anstellen können. Das sage ich dann aber alles hinterher nochmal, nur dass Sie sich darauf einstellen, wenn Ihnen Fragen ganz dringend auf die Nägel brennen, Sie können das dann eben im Anschluss, können Sie die alle stellen. Bevor ich jetzt an Lea Ypi ergebe, noch einmal mein Dank dem Haus der Kulturen der Welt und auch dem Team des Haus der Kulturen der Welt. Lale de Boer, Sebastian Sprenger und Jan Trautmann haben seit Wochen waren sie mit uns in Kontakt und haben das hier mit ermöglicht. Die Übersetzer Felix Kurz und Max Henninger, die da oben in dem Kabuff sitzen und von Ihnen allen nicht gesehen werden können. Ich sehe sie hier in dem hell erleuchteten, hinter dem Fenster. Und weiterhin, Frau von Blumenthal hat es schon erwähnt, natürlich unsere New Institute Foundation, die das Ganze hier ermöglicht, das Center und diese Lectures, aber auch unsere Medienpartnern Philomac und Agora24, die hier auch vertreten sind und an deren Ständen Sie auch sich informieren können. Ebenfalls möchte ich dem Surkamp Verlag, der hier auch mit einem Stand vertreten ist, danken. Und Sie werden die heute hier gehaltenen Lectures, genauso wie die Lectures, die letztes Jahr von Sally Hesslinger gehalten worden sind, ja in einer Publikation dann in eben jenem Verlag auch wiederfinden. Ja, jetzt aber los mit Lea Ypi und dem moralischen Sozialismus. Danke dir nochmal ganz, ganz herzlich, dass du unsere Einladung angenommen hast und ich bin sehr, sehr gespannt, was wir über die nächsten 3 Tage hier erfahren werden. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here to give the first of these 3 Benjamin lectures on the topic of what is moral socialism. Thank you to all of those who chose the capitalism versus moral socialism match to the Germany versus Hungary football one. It was speculated that you came because you preferred socialism. I think it's because you preferred the fight between socialism and capitalism. And that's what you're going to get. The aim of these lectures is to answer the question that is posed in all the posters that I have seen have been covering Berlin over the last few days, namely, what is moral socialism? But maybe the first thing to do before trying to answer a question is to motivate it, and so to explain why it's a good question at all. So I'm going to start doing just that, and I'm going to start with the 2 words in the title. First, moral, and then socialism, and why, therefore, moral socialism. To which I am tempted to give a very quick, first kind of humorous answer, which says, well, would you rather have immoral socialism? And then you might say, actually, no, just moral capitalism. So what's wrong with that? Maybe with some European mayonnaise without American ketchup, but still, capitalism. And we have 3 full evenings to make the case, but here is the first quick answer. I think moral capitalism is an oxymoron. And so we are actually, as a question, more likely to make progress with the question of moral socialism than with the question of moral capitalism. And the reason for that is in the words. Capitalism is a relation based on the exchange of things. And socialism is a relation based on the recognition of people. So my first attempt at answering the question of why not moral capitalism is that morality applies much more straightforwardly to people than it applies to things. And it applies much more straightforwardly to our relationship to each other than it applies to our relationship to stuff. So there's something, I think, fundamentally problematic about a society that bases the recognition of the relationship between people on how we think about their relationship to things, as is the case of capitalist societies. And I'm going to, as you will see over the course of these lectures, return to the implications of just this point. So for now, let me go back again to the question, why and what is moral socialism? And so again, I'll say something about the socialism part now and then something about the moral part. So what is socialism? There is an old joke that says that socialism is the painful transition from capitalism to capitalism. And actually, I don't think that joke gives a historically inaccurate definition. And actually, I think even if the aim of socialism is to make capitalism just a little bit better, that still makes it worth thinking about socialism. That should be enough to make you interested in it. But I'll go with a more philosophical answer, which is that I think socialism is the set of political and social relations that, under current circumstances, aspires to the fullest possible realization of what I call freedom of agency. And by current circumstances, I mean the circumstances of globalized capitalism that are familiar to most of us. And if you're in any doubt on whether we live in a capitalist world, I recommend you pull out your phone, which some of you might already have out because I might be checking the football game results, and take a look at the various little icons and the various little apps through which we communicate with each other. We order food, we read books, we listen to music, we move around, we organize our travels, everything that's in that little box. And behind every little flashing icon in that box, there is a massive private company. And behind the very container of all these little icons, there is also a private company. So capitalism is a system that is characterized by private ownership of the means of production, incentivized by the pursuit of profit, and shaped by the exchange between wage labor and capital. And I will return to some of these terms later on. But I take it that at this broad level, the definition is relatively uncontroversial. So let me take it one step further and then ask, if socialism aspires to liberating us from the unfreedom of capitalism, isn't socialism inherently moral by definition? So supposing it's a good thing to aspire to socialism, why would we want to aspire, why would we want to add the moral thing to that concept? Isn't the word moral kind of redundant? And as it happens, the view that morality is redundant and irrelevant to socialism was the view of the majority of socialist scholars over the past century. And the reason was, as many traditional socialists argued, that the question of moral socialism is misleading, maybe even intentionally misleading, bordering on a kind of sabotage on the real struggle, which should be to overcome capitalism. And so the question of moral socialism was, for much of the past century, thought to kind of distract us from this real struggle that matters, and even worse, to actually undermine the real goals of that struggle. So to add morality to the word socialism was, in the best possible case, redundant, and in the worst possible case, perverse. To add morality to socialism, said one famous socialist, Leon Trotsky, is like exuding twice the amount of your moral sweat, similar to people who perspire twice simply out of fear. Now, Trotsky wrote these sentences in an article that has the self-explanatory title of Their Moral and Ours. And the Time had thought, wrote Trotsky in that article, to abandon the moralism of religion and also the idealism of the Enlightenment, and to pay due tribute to philosophical idealism by saying that yes, it had played an important role so far. However, as he put it, having torn from heaven, moral philosophy now has to find its earthly roots. And to discover these roots was one of the tasks, again, I quote from Trotsky, of materialism. Now, if there was a kind of counter-revolutionary or counter-insurgent group in this audience who would want to come up and with a kind of counter-title to this evening's and the next few evenings' topic, it would be exactly the same as Trotsky's title, Their Moral and Ours. And that's because that is the exact opposite of what I'm going to argue, that morality is universal and plays a fundamental role in social critique, including in socialist critique. To find earthly roots to moral philosophy, as Trotsky asks, is in fact not to abandon the moral critique of capitalism, but to show the specific ways in which it undermines something that we all care about, which is freedom. So this is what I'm going to argue. Now, that Trotsky article, and then I'll leave Trotsky in a minute, intended, amongst other things, to discredit this idea that there can ever be a moral standpoint, independent from the material reality of conflict, and more specifically of class conflict, from which you can judge the aims of socialist action. So socialism, on his account, quote, deduces a rule of conduct from the laws of the development of society, therefore primarily from class struggle, which, as he puts it, is the law of laws. And the end, as Trotsky explains, flows from the historical movement. So what is this law of laws? And how can we avoid turning the god of religion into the god of history? The answer is actually in Trotsky's own biography. He wrote this article titled Their Moral and Ours in February 1938, and that was just a few weeks before the Anschluss, in what would become the first act of territorial aggression committed by Nazi Germany that would pave the way to the Second World War. And around the same time, a French-educated Albanian lawyer had written an article published in the first issue of an Albanian magazine called The New World, which was a progressive magazine. This was an author that had studied and lived in Paris, where he had been involved in the Popular Front, as it happens around the same time in which Trotsky also spent some weeks and months in exile in Paris, although I'm not sure they ever met. And as you know, I'm from Albania, and I mention that not just because it's cool to be from Albania, which it is, and I recommend it to everyone, but because it kind of matters to the argument that I'm going to make. So this Albanian article was published in 1936 and was entitled Lessons from History. And I'm going to read out a few sentences from this article. I won't read them in Albanian. So this now goes the quote. History is an accurate mirror in every step of social evolution. It shows us that intellectuals have played a productive role in the search for how to improve political and economic conditions, but more importantly, how to improve our ability to reflect on them. Think about, the article continues, the relentless intellectual struggle of Enlightenment thinkers, which was continued with the French Revolution, the symbol of a tainted past, the storming of the Bastille, replete with injustice. And think about the world of idealist intellectuals who, as ordinary people, popularized these philosophers' principles. Their ideas, the article continues, based on reason, reflected nothing other than the aspirations of the masses. They showed that education, culture, enlightenment unite us with them and against those who oppress us and benefit from this injustice. End of quote. Now, the author of this article had a lot of things in common with Trotsky. They were both socialists that were writing from a position of solidarity with the people. But they were not of the people. They were neither peasants nor workers. Both came from wealthy landowning elites, in Trotsky's case, Jewish Ukrainian one, and the Albanian one, a Muslim landowning elite. Which is to say that in both cases, the reason for this prima facie identification with what they call the masses were actually moral reasons. They had nothing to do with their class position, and they had nothing to do with the class interest that that position would have asked them to pursue. And both, as you will have seen in the text that I cited, recognize and acknowledge the centrality of history in connection to political events. But there's one important difference, and it concerns the relation between moral principles and politics, political agency. Because unlike Trotsky, where moral principles are derived from what he considers to be the laws of history and then discarded, and then the laws of history take over and become their own thing, in the case of this author, as he puts it, philosophical reasoning is crucial to improve our ability to reflect on historical events and to advance critiques of society. And reason, or more specifically, critical reason, is our anchor for engaging with social reality. So the Albanian author who has written this article was my grandfather. And almost exactly 10 years after publishing this article, at the age of 33, he was arrested by the communist government that had come to power in Albania at the end of the Second World War and sentenced to 15 years in prison for agitation and propaganda. And if you do something which is very fashionable right now, which is to go to Albania as a tourist, and you do something that's very unfashionable for Albanians, which is to take the train, you will, it's an excruciatingly slow train, and if you go south on that train, you will at some point go over a bridge that is called the Bona Bridge, which was built with the labor of my grandfather and his inmates. So my grandfather, like Trotsky, were both victims of Stalinism. And unlike Trotsky, he never had Bolshevik sympathies. And also unlike Trotsky, he never had actually much faith in these laws of history of which both he and Trotsky ended up becoming a victim, and in the name of which he was sentenced and Trotsky was actually killed. But he remained a socialist even after he came out of prison, and in the time that he had left to live, he continued to write and research on the same topics that he had written this article that I've just quoted, the legacy of the Enlightenment, the role of intellectuals, their relationship to the people, the social purpose of art, and he actually remained a principled social democrat. Now, he was also someone that I think the social democrats of today would really struggle to recognize as one of theirs, because even after having been to prison in communist Albania for 15 years, he came out and continued to say that he didn't think that democracy and capitalism were compatible. And this was a conviction that he retained until his death in communist Albania. He didn't live to see the transition. So I started by mentioning these stories to just say that my reflection on socialism and my effort to recover this moral critique of capitalism grows out of this complicated relationship with the so-called real existing socialisms of the past century, including the theories propounded by these governments, and also an equally complicated relationship with the failures of capitalism. And post-communist societies still struggle with the legacy of the past, but actually very little of that discomfort and that struggle makes its way into Western European publics, to the other side, and to the liberal democracies that we are under, where left-wing discussions about socialism proceed as though this just was not something that ever concerned them. It was entirely irrelevant to their predicament. And I think it's this exact inability that we have to engage with both the complete tragic moral failure of socialism in the past century and the tragic moral failure of capitalism that we continue to witness that is actually responsible for a lot of the misfortunes that we experience, including the crisis of the left and including the rise of the far right. And since we are all in Germany, I suspect much of that discomfort and the way it reverberates in the divisions between Western Germany and Eastern Germany is also still there, and it's still there like an unprocessed trauma. So in Albania, and this is where the trauma and the difficulty consist in, and in many of the former Eastern European communist states, the socialist tradition is still viewed with great suspicion because of the immoral qualities that it took in the past century and because of the historical experiences that it forced upon people. And therefore, most people in that side of the world, which is one side of the world I come from, people think only history matters, and this view of the laws of history that just crush everyone who is subjected to them. And on the other hand, in Western Europe, in the liberal societies that I have migrated to, the paternalism with which these real-world experiences of socialism was experienced is actually dismissed or just ignored, or somehow it's like a footnote to the experiences of left-wing intellectuals. And here, only philosophy matters, only these great ideas, and the history is just something that can be put to one side, especially if it's the history of these remote places. So how can one reconcile a philosophical approach that recovers what I think is the moral desirability of socialism with a historical critique of former socialist experiences with a political critique of contemporary capitalist societies? And as I say, my effort grows out of this unease with these traditions. On the one hand, the tradition of immoral socialism that was pursued at such high human cost, this tradition of the their moral and our moral in the 20th century. And on the other hand, the constant accumulation of failures by capitalist societies, whom we are always somehow willing to exonerate or apologize for, or say that there's really not much of an alternative, and both intellectual and political, and which kind of condemns us to think of capitalism as the only possibility for the future and the only way through which we can make sense of the world. And this legacy of this way of thinking is what exactly we've observed in the developments of the left over the last few decades since the end of the Cold War, where on the one hand, in Eastern Europe, the left was co-opted into the neoliberal transformation of their former socialist societies, whereas on the other hand, the Western left was liberated by these associations with state socialism and somehow also with all association to socialism altogether, and where it began to hail the emergence of this new world order that was marked by opportunities for prosperity and respect for democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and so on. And with all of these new commitments, the new left that emerged in the West from this end of the Cold War in the post-1989 agenda was doing actually quite okay for a while. It was performing well in the electoral scene. It was able to shape the trajectory of many societies, and including the agenda of European integration. But that also meant that because it was doing so well electorally, it actually stopped thinking about alternatives to society. And where the only parameters for thinking about change was legal change within the boundaries of the rule of law and of the nation state. And where its only remaining aspiration was actually to tame capitalism rather than to overcome it. So the left in this transition in the West went, in the East it was completely abandoned, and the East was not unreceptive to what was happening in the West. In the West, it turned into a kind of project of social emancipation from a project that had been global and transformative and systemic to one of national reform through the rule of law. And so it became a civic project rather than an internationalist one. And in that process, it surrendered politics and it turned to policy. It turned to administration, it turned to responsible government, and to thinking about how we can all share the benefits of this global capitalist market that actually was never challenged as a structure, as a whole. Now, we know now, from where we are now, that that free global capitalist market didn't perform as well as it was expected to do. So social inequalities over these decades increased, regional divides remained significant, and the various cycles of financial crisis continued to erode the traditional welfare state, while austerity programs, often supported by the left, began to take hold across Europe. And in international terms, this project of national rule of law turned into a project of international civilization, where left governments became complicit in the wars that were waged in the name of human rights, which resulted in destruction and chaos all over the world, from the Balkans to the Middle East, and then followed by increasing refugee and migration flows. So the third way project of combining democracy and capitalism through domestic, legal, and international civilizational practices has been actually quite significantly discredited in the last few years. And yet, there is no systemic critique, or very little systemic critique, of the status quo, other than the ones that sometimes began to be articulated and then became mainstream by far-right groups. So guess who declared about 7 years ago that he was a Leninist? It was Donald Trump's chief political strategist, Steve Bannon. And that's hardly a moral alternative to the status quo. Now, when I say that there was no moral alternative to the status quo, I don't want to say that there are no fundamental critiques of capitalism circulating in various environments, including places like this one, including universities, social movements, sometimes even political parties. So you have post-colonial theory, we have environmental justice activism, we have anti-war movement, we have techno-utopian movement, we have human rights struggles, which are all really important and a really important component of public debate. And it's not a coincidence that the far right is going for those as well, so they might be gone soon. But they do this from a position, and they already did this from a position of weakness and of fragmentation, having abandoned the effort to come up with a coherent and a unified, even if it's internally diverse, systemic alternative. And so this is why I think it's really important to recover something like the spirit of the Enlightenment, understood as this return to this analysis of society that are based on an attempt to recuperate both the universalism of the Enlightenment and the critical spirit that characterizes it. And that's where my effort, and what I'm going to talk about here, becomes both historical and philosophical. It's historical because I don't think any set of ideas or any proposals ever come up in a vacuum. And actually, historically, my effort is also to recover this lost tradition that was lost with all the other forbidden socialists, like my grandfathers, that were marginalized and squeezed out of this titanic clash between state socialism and capitalism in the 20th century. And it's obviously philosophical because I don't think we can just adapt and integrate what some people in the past said. We have to kind of find our own answers, and so we sit on the shoulders of these giants, but for most of the time, but sometimes we have to come down these shoulders and get lost in the woods and find our own path. So what do I want to find from moral socialism? There's both a political and a philosophical answer to this question. And the philosophical one will be the one that will actually take me over most of these next few evenings. So I will say something briefly about politically what it means. And I think what I try to do is to give a critique of capitalism that might persuade even those who are not sympathetic and might indeed be immediately hostile to this tradition of state socialism, and that feel just as nervous as I do about the historical legacy of those socialisms, and to acknowledge that difficulty, but also might equally feel, and these two intuitions might go hand in hand, that there's something fundamentally wrong about capitalism, and that something fundamentally different needs to be done, and that we just can't go on normalizing the oppression that capitalism generates and that is characteristic of dominant ways of thinking. And that's because one of my ongoing convictions has been that while a lot of people think of socialism and liberalism as completely different traditions, one is about equality and the other is about freedom, I actually think that the moral socialist tradition that I'm going to speak about promotes the same and has the same concern for freedom as liberals, and the same attempt to show the limitations of projects where freedom is limited to particular categories of people, say citizens of certain states or members of particular groups. And so it seems to me that at its best, this moral socialist tradition, what it does is that it radicalizes the liberal idea of freedom and in some ways advances the same critical project of the Enlightenment that was crucial to the attempt to undermine the authoritarian structures from which many historical liberals try to liberate themselves. So if you want a slogan to summarize, or a kind of election banner, something to write on the election banner of the moral socialist, I would say socialism is liberalism minus capitalism. So what I'm going to do today is to try and sketch out the elements of this alternative approach to socialism. And as you will see, I'll mention some of the intellectual heroes, but the two main figures that loom above are Kant on the one hand and Marx on the other, and the effort to reconcile what is traditionally considered to be the idealism of the one and the materialism on the other. And on some superficial reading, you couldn't think of authors with a greater distance between them, because Kant is someone who talks about the superiority of goodwill over nature. Marx says that this goodwill corresponds to the impotence and wretchedness of the German burghers. For Kant, freedom is a fact of reason. For Marx, reason is something that develops socially. Kant is said to appreciate contractual relations, and Marx thinks these are all concealed forms of social coercion. Kant is actually someone who you think of as a quintessential philosopher that only interprets the world. Marx is someone who is angry with those who just want to interpret the world and actually wants to change it. Some people will say that Kant will come up with something like, at the end, rational theology, and Marx says that that religion is the opium of the people. And even on questions of political change, Marx talks about the position that Kant occupies as parliamentary cretinism, because he was committed to social reform and also committed to saying that revolution was not justified from a moral perspective. And for Marx, on the other hand, as you know, the famous sentence, the ruling classes should tremble at the idea of revolution. So I'm going over the course of these three lectures to show that there is a nuanced reading, a more nuanced reading on each of these problems. But let me just start with a brief historical nod to all the people who actually have tried in the past to reconcile Kantianism and Marxism, so this idealism with materialism. There are key figures in the German philosophical tradition that include the founding father of German social democracy, Eduard Bernstein, who was, again, much better than the social democrats that we know now, in terms of how he thought about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. People like Hermann Cohen, Vorländer, Staudinger, and then in the Austrian context, there are authors like Max Adler, Otto Bauer, Karl Renner, and a lot of these debates actually take place in the pages of the Neue Zeit, the journal of the German Social Democratic Party, and were really lively. And as I say, squeezed out by the orthodoxy of the Second International as it kept on developing, but were really interesting when they were happening. And then later on, in kind of more academic quarters, there was efforts to reconcile Kant and Marx by someone called Lucien Goldmann, who was someone influenced by the young Georg Lukács, despite the hostility of the old Georg Lukács to his earlier self, and therefore also to Goldmann, who kind of has an interpretation of Kant which insists on this importance of freedom in the development of philosophy of history. There is, I think, even further on in English-speaking analytical circles, I think there are elements of reconciliation between Kant and Marx, even in the philosophy of someone like John Rawls, where people might think it's controversial, but where I think his liberal theory of justice, as Rawls himself puts it, is much more compatible with something that he calls property-owning democracy and liberal socialism, vis-a-vis the other two regime types that he considers laissez-faire capitalism and welfare state capitalism. And of course, there are echoes of moral socialism in the Frankfurt School tradition and in a number of Western Marxist authors like Sartre and even Gramsci with a stretch. So that's just a very quick overview over some of, as I say, the giants on whose shoulders this attempt rests. But to give these thoughts a bit more substance, let me start with the words of one of the people I mentioned, the German neo-Kantian philosopher, Hermann Cohen, who in 1896 declared, and I quote, that Immanuel Kant is the true founder of German socialism, and that socialism is based on moral idealism. So what was this intuition based on? And in the case of Cohen, it could be really summarized in a very simple sentence. He thought that the Kantian categorical imperative, in one of its formulations, which asks us to treat human beings always also as ends in themselves and never just as means, is actually incompatible with capitalist practices. Because capitalist practices inherently turn people into commodities. And Cohen also suggested that this Kantian kingdom of ends, which is understood as a union of moral ends, where the moral ends of different agents form an integrated social whole, represents an ideal of a solidaristic community which excludes class conflicts, class oppression, and capitalist exploitation. For the Austro-Marxists, on the other hand, what's really important is not so much the direct application of these ethical prescriptions to the question of the justification of socialism, but something that I think goes even more to the core of the question that I'm trying to get at, which is the way in which Kant's ethics enables us to address skepticism about the role of morality in society. And so, as Otto Bauer puts this in this essay on Marxism and ethics that was written in 1906, and that was also, I think, in the summary of my flyers for the lecture, quote, "If we regard the social question no longer as a scientific issue, but as one involving a practical attitude, it becomes a moral question. The driving force of class struggles," he explains, "is not just class interest, but also the class ideology that arises from particular conditions. And it's there, when we think about the justification of socialism, not just a question of science, but of practical attitude or of life. And if we try to persuade someone who is kind of sitting on the edge, and he calls him the waverer, who asks us, well, why should I be a socialist? I'm not working class, I'm not affected by capitalist exploitation. If we want an answer to that person, Otto Bauer thought that the Kantian method could be useful, and the moral socialist program could be useful. So let me now go a little bit more into why Bauer made this case and why I think it's a case worth making again, and develop, which is what I'm going to do also tomorrow and Friday, develop a bit more this thought. In the Critique of Pure Reason, in the section on the canon of pure reason, Kant argues that all interests of reason are captured in three questions. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? And all these answers, Kant then says in further lectures on logic, converge on a fourth, or these three questions converge on a fourth question, which really encapsulates all three of them. And the question is, was ist der Mensch? Now, as you will have noticed, my 3 Benjamin lectures are also all structured by these questions. So by the end, everyone will know what the Mensch is when they get out of here on Friday evening. So let me just say something briefly about the first one. What can I know? And why, you might say. Why should a socialist even care about the problem of what can I know? How does the problem of knowledge relate to the problem of socialism? So surely, you might say, forget about the first question and just move to the second and the third. And that's actually exactly the same position from which Marx starts in the introduction to the German ideology, in the famous paragraphs that have been quoted and quoted about the essence of historical materialism, where he says, quote, "In direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. We set out from real, active men, and on the basis of their real life processes, we demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. Morality, religion, metaphysics," continues Marx, "all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence." End of quote. So the answer to the problem, what can I know, is kind of crucial, because the question that lags behind is, well, is all philosophy just a form of ideology? And as it happens, that depends on what we mean by philosophy. So we need to ask the question, well, what is philosophy? Towards the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, in the section entitled On the Architectonic of Pure Reason, that is devoted to the unity of the system, Kant says, he gives a definition, and he says, philosophy is the sum total of all our efforts to philosophize. It's kind of a disappointing answer. He doesn't speak about the material conditions under which these efforts develop, but the further elaboration that he then offers of this statement has surprising implications for how you think about the relationship of philosophy and ideology, including this challenge that comes from the historical materialist position. And that's because in this effort to elaborate this question, Kant distinguishes between two different ways of thinking about philosophy. So you ask yourself, what is a philosophy? What is philosophy? And he says you come up with two answers. The first one is what he calls the Schulbegriff der Philosophie, the scholastic concept of philosophy. And the second one is what he calls the world or the cosmic concept of philosophy, the Weltbegriff. According to the first one, to this scholastic concept, and I'll get to socialism in a minute, don't worry, philosophy constitutes the system of all philosophical cognition and tries to achieve the perfection of knowledge. It's therefore an ideal of scientific completion, concerned with how we organize cognitions within different sciences and with the taxonomy of these different sciences, human and natural. And this was typical of the effort that all the 18th century systematizing philosophers were making when they were trying to distinguish between what they call the esprit de système and the esprit systématique. Now, Kant isn't happy with this Schulbegriff, is not happy with the scholastic definition of philosophy. And that's because he says, actually, there is a better and a richer and a more interesting answer to this problem, what is philosophy, which he defines as the science of the relation of all cognition to the essential ends of human reason. In other words, what he's saying is that the question of the content of perfect knowledge is inseparable from the question of the human value of knowledge. And so on the first definition, Kant says the representatives of scholastic philosophy are just what he calls technicians of reason, Vernunftkünstler. So they don't have any other ambition, he says. They just want to accumulate knowledge for the sake of accumulating knowledge without considering how this knowledge contributes to the ends of reason, to thinking about the purpose of being human. And although he says they contribute kind of successfully to formulate these rules of understanding, they are, and he insists on this, they will always be technicians of reason rather than legislators. Again, Vernunftkünstler. And following Socrates, he then goes even more stronger on the critique by saying that actually the more appropriate label for these types of guys, for these Schulbegriffe guys, is the label of a philodox, a lover of doxa, of opinion, rather than of wisdom. And again, a philosopher, a philodox, he says, this scholastic guy, a philodox is related to the philosopher in the same way in which, wait for it, the businessman is related to the legislator. So basically, Kant is agreeing with Marx that some ways of doing philosophy can be considered merely ideological. And in defending this cosmic understanding of philosophy as a systematic endeavor that is guided by our rational moral vocation, he's actually delivering a critique of technocratic reason, which is the accumulation of knowledge and science and expertise for its own sake. But that's all, it's not all there is, because Kant argues that there's another way of viewing the philosopher, this legislator of human reason, and that is, quote, as a teacher in the ideal. And then, even more perplexingly, and then I'll stop with the quotes from the first critique, he says, well, what is this philosopher who is a teacher in the ideal? And the answer he gives is, this is nowhere to be found. For as he puts it, where is it? Who has possession of it? By what can it be recognized? And so this is where the question of knowledge becomes, and wisdom becomes connected to the question of the value of knowledge. And although philosophers, Kant says, and insists on this, remain an ideal, one can learn to philosophize. And Kant thought that this takes the form of a practice, the practice of reason, which is to reflect on general principles, and always with what he calls a kind of reservation to reject what is not compatible with these principles. So basically, what Kant is doing is, as I say, he's agreeing with Marx that the part of philosophy is ideology, and then he's trying to recover, well, what does it mean to think of philosophy not as an ideology, and how do we connect it to these essential ends of human reason? And he asks us to focus on the centrality for this way of understanding philosophy of both moral and political purposes, with something that is missing in much contemporary debates and contemporary ways of thinking about relation between sciences, the systematic relations between different aspects of what it means to be human. And so the methodology with which this is pursued in the first critique, as you know, it's like a kind of coming-of-age story where reason is the protagonist and reason is fighting with these two enemies, dogmatism on the one hand, skepticism on the other, and where on the one hand it gets very, very sad because it knows that it's the source of all doubts and criticism and error. On the other hand, it gets kind of reassured because it sees that it can figure it out somehow, and there are rules of understanding and reason that help us work through these claims to try and sort out what are the valid claims, what are the self-correcting ones. And indeed, although the starting point is that reason and authority are mixed up, it is possible to distinguish them, and that in some ways is the project of the Enlightenment. And to pursue this project of the Enlightenment, we can't rely on what we are given. We can't rely on social and religious norms. We can't rely on positive law, because these are all potentially ideological. And we can't rely on the standards that are given to us just by where we come from, our family or our gender or where we grow up, since to take all of those for granted is to start with something that is arbitrary and that needs to stand to scrutiny to be continued a valid claim. So for Kant, the Enlightenment is the project of learning to philosophize and the project of the emergence of human beings from this self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity, he says, is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without the help of another, and it's self-incurred because its cause lies in ourselves and in the lack of resolution and courage to fight paternalism and authority. Now, a lot of people tend to dismiss of this by saying that this is kind of just abstract and general and doesn't really help you with anything specific. But Kant, also in developing what is enlightenment, gives you criteria and gives you rules that help us exercise reason and help us learn in this way. And he does that by trying to distinguish between what he calls the public use of reason and the private use of reason, which is the use of reason that we make in the different social roles that we occupy. And while the private use of reason is premised on the acceptance of authority that comes with the recognition of these particular obligations, the public use of reason requires working to ensure that we can't just adopt identities and that we scrutinize them and critically engage with them. So this is important to distinguish why philosophers are nowhere to be found on the basis of that analysis. And even though it's kind of easy to understand where Kant was going, it's hard to understand in our time where our public use of reason is increasingly captured by privatized interests, and where actually we have a public sphere that is in some ways wider and more inclusive than the one that Kant was dealing with, but that's also in many other ways more shallow and less critical, where actually dissent takes the form of clamorous acts of individual self-expression, preferably recorded on a mobile phone, rather than in the construction of political spaces for critical engagement. So Kant lived in an age of crisis that was marked, like ours, by great advances in science and in technology, but collapse in values and collapse in belief in authority. But he carved out a role for reason as a universal capacity that tries to steer this middle path between skepticism and dogmatism. And that conception of reason is, I think, though very, very hard, what we need to revive in societies like ours that are trapped and strangled by particular interests on the one hand and the individualization of political commitment on the other. Now, I don't think Marx was critical of this part of Kant's definition of the Enlightenment. And I don't think he had any reason to object to this hostility to authority that Kant expresses and to the project of liberating yourself from this authority. Because what socialist theory does is that it gives you a kind of more, and this is what I'm going to say a little bit in the next few lectures, it just gives you a more specific account of the particular forms that authority takes in certain empirical circumstances, like the circumstance of our society, by showing us what are the structural obstacles to this process of enlightenment, and by pointing out how ideology, alienation, and false consciousness are actually obstacles to what we can achieve without a more complex understanding of where they come from, which particular elites serve them, and so on. So then the socialist project becomes one of explaining what are the pathologies of unfreedom, and why does capitalism undermine freedom and makes a mockery of this aspiration to the Enlightenment. And so then socialism becomes, with Kant, not the project of the philosopher kings, but of the citizens that try to become philosophers. Now, Marx is better known for insisting against this tradition that the weapon of criticism can't supplant the criticism of weapons, and that material force must be overthrown with material force. But what Marx also insisted with, and this is something that people forget, is that when theory sizes the masses, it becomes material force itself. And so this is, again, the more critical understanding of the Enlightenment, which highlights how the materialist alignment with the idealist commitment are actually much more compatible than it looks at face value. And while Marx agreed and criticized Kant because he thought that theory should mobilize and emancipate the masses, and that Kantian tradition, the German idealist tradition, was too focused on reason and didn't think about the broader structural issues that undermine the working of reason. For Kant, this was just what the Enlightenment was, this emergence from this self-incurred immaturity. Okay, I'm going to return to all of this in the next couple of lectures. So I just want to leave you for today with 4 fundamental insights that I think we can gain from this effort to critically recover the Enlightenment. And don't worry, I know the Enlightenment has a lot of problems as well. They will be all resolved in the 3rd lecture. But you're very welcome to ask me about them now as well, if you can't wait. So 4 insights. The first one is that we need to recover a way of diagnosing the conflicts of society that is as inclusive as possible, and that can explain why freedom of agency, understood in this moralized way, and this is also the topic of tomorrow, why is it hindered from a global perspective? So Kant is a global thinker, and the world concept of philosophy, the Weltbegriff that I just mentioned, and the keys in the Welt part, is as crucial epistemically as his cosmopolitanism is politically. Our problems are global, and our efforts to reflect on them need to recover this global way of thinking. And our attempts to analyze what goes on in the world can't be to just return to simple forms of identity, which lose this common ground that these identities all share. So the second one is we need to recover, the second insight is to recover the Enlightenment critique of society, because it's a kind of critique that matured in times of crisis, and it's useful to navigate crisis, and we live in times of crisis. So Kant is a thinker of crisis. He lived in a kind of time of great turmoil, in a moment that, as I said, was marked by both scientific and cultural revolution, but also collapse in values. And he tried to reflect on what kind of tools do we have to navigate these crises by thinking about essential capacities that we have, functions of reason, that can help us navigate these uncertainties. And he came up with a very sophisticated notion of reason, which is the foundation of social critique, all the while recognizing that there are these social roles that we all occupy and obligations that are due to these roles. But he insisted that we can't reduce them, we can't reduce reason to these social roles. So this brings me to the third point. We need to recover a concept of reason as universal legislation. So Kant is a kind of critical thinker. He understands that the human is at the center of everything. And when you say it's at the center of everything, it means both good and bad. And that to develop our critical capacities, we need cognitive, cultural, and material resources. And I will return to these points next couple of days. And as I say, in reflecting on where these capacities are grounded, he carves this role for reason between skepticism and dogmatism, and I think outlines a path, which is the path of criticism, which is what we need now. But criticism turned into a social project, as I'll explain. So we need to fight skepticism, because only with skepticism there is no faith in the human, no hope for the future, and also no constructive thinking. But we also need to fight dogmatism, because just with dogmatism, there's too much faith and not enough criticism of authority and of the different forms of ideological manipulation and false consciousness that we are constantly confronted with. Fourth point, we need to place our thinking within a horizon of peace and globally just political relations, which is what Kant's cosmopolitanism is essentially about. And this is perhaps the greatest difference between someone like Kant and someone like Hegel, who are both influences on the Marxist tradition, and actually the reason to, I think, support Kant on this. So like Hegel, Kant thought that in a globalized world, the central agents of history were states, but that states were not condemned to fighting each other always, as Hegel ended up concluding. So Hegel thought there are these agents and they just fight each other on the world sphere and that's the end of the matter. And in that sense, I think the Kantian analysis is much closer to the socialist tradition and to a more nuanced account of the world where the diagnosis is on this global social structure that is capitalism, which undermines freedom, including the freedom that is embodied by the liberal state in its aspirations, and that is also therefore closer to Marxist ideal of a classless society, which is a society that has fundamentally resolved conflict, a society of peace. And Kant's project of perpetual peace is aligned with that tradition. So in this sense, you might say that the kind of Kantian kingdom of ends, and again, I'll say a lot more about this next time, is the moral ideal of a world free from conflict that is difficult to realize in a social system that is premised on competition, antagonism, class differences, and perpetrates conflict, and indeed feeds off that conflict, lives of it, including war. So with Kant and Marx, we have to recognize unfreedom not just within and between states, but also between agents that transcend state borders. And again, this is an insight that comes from Kant's cosmopolitanism, where you have these relations that go over and above the relationship between states. For Kant, this means, as I say, recovering, to begin with, a global epistemic standpoint, hence the question of what can I know, which then becomes critique of society. For Marx, it means acknowledging the capitalist class as a global entity that perpetuates these injustices, because Marx says, under capitalist, and this is the punchline, under capitalist relations, the Kantian ideal of perpetual peace becomes really difficult to realize. So I'm going to continue all of this tomorrow. So I'm just going to leave you with one final thought about this world concept of philosophy and the importance of recovering this cosmopolitan standpoint. Because the theory of right that comes out of this critical way of thinking, out of the critique of reason, is actually really a theory of what I call global relational freedom, where you have private right, public right, international right, cosmopolitan right, and these aren't just kind of stacked up on each other like little IKEA boxes, but they are actually harmonically integrated and systematically integrated, and where, although for someone like Kant, property, for example, was an essential component of realizing freedom of agency, if you think about what does that mean, this connection between private, public, domestic, international, cosmopolitan right mean for private property, then you get a very, very different picture from one that says, well, first we realize private property in the state, and then we kind of figure out what goes on in different other levels. So the right of individuals for Kant to access and to use external resources, including the right of individuals, as I say, to hold property, depends on a globally just framework of political relations and on everyone having the capacity to develop their moral agency. So if we value freedom, and this is where I'm really like last words, if we value freedom in this kind of universal relational sense, the question of knowledge, which you might have thought I was going to answer, can't actually be answered without the question of action. So if you think critically about the human from this systematic perspective, and if you think about reason in this critical way, the challenge of what can we know is not separated from the challenge of what we should do, the second Kantian question. And so that takes us to the next question that Kant poses with regard to the interest of reason, which is the question of what ought I do? Also, incidentally, the Lenin question, what should be done? And now this is the point at which what should be done, this is the point at which philosophers say, well, I've run out of space, outside scope of my paper, you've heard me for so long, And I'm sorry, I really have a lot to say, but I've run out of time. But I can't say that because fortunately, or unfortunately for the capitalists in the room, all we have to do is wait until tomorrow evening. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for an exciting and rich talk, and for the cliffhanger at the end, which is, we couldn't be more excited to learn what to do tomorrow. So as I said, we'll have a Q&A, and there are 2 mics in the aisles. You can just queue at those mics, and we will then try to answer the questions. And as I said, feel free to ask them in German. We are going to, Lea does understand German, and I'm going to translate it as well, so feel free.
Hi, thank you so much for your lectures. It was very, very interesting. And my question is in regards to the last 4 takeaways that you had. And I would be very interested in you elaborating more on the second point you made. Sorry, I'm a little bit Chinese, so I have to look like that. Okay, so basically on that we have to recover enlightenment, especially in times of crisis. And I found that very interesting also from like an activist sort of perspective, because I thought, what does that mean specifically, precisely, to recover these terms of enlightenment in a way that is actually, you know, in materialist politics, or that we can see in everyday politics too, especially with regards to your point on global relations and freedom. And also because when we learn about Kant, for example, in school, we never really think of Kant as having these materialist points. Reason and moral seem like these very abstract terms that are, yeah, sort of separated from actual politics. So I would love for you to go into that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I guess the spirit of the effort is to say the Enlightenment is a practice. And I think it's very important what Kant says when he says, well, where are the philosophers? Where basically what he's saying is it's not a practice that even the philosophers can guide. It's a learning process, which means that we actively, as human beings, engage and think critically about our societies. And when Kant gives the maxims of the Enlightenment, he gives these 3 criteria, which is to what he calls the enlarged thinking, thinking consistently, and putting yourself in the place of everyone else. And as I say, these criteria, they seem very general and very abstract, but they actually do a lot of work when you ask yourself about specific political practices in guiding critiques of society. For once, they remove the dominant double standards that we see where rich states say one thing and do another thing in other parts of the world, or promote one discourse of emancipation and fighting corruption here and a completely different discourse. So thinking consistently is something that if you turn that into a source of criticism of your own societies, rules out and shows you the ideologically underpinnings of a number of commonsensical assumptions that are made and are presented. So again, it's not something, and this is what's very interesting about this effort, about the Enlightenment as a whole, it's more about cultivating a certain capacity of thinking about the problem rather than resolving the problem. It's not that you can get out of Kant or out of this tradition a kind of 10-point program of how to solve the world. This is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. What it's giving is saying, look, there are these principles. These are the principles of reason that survive scrutiny after you've done all this work of figuring out where does the reason get into dogma, into superstition, into thinking from religious premises or from authority premises or from family premises or from any other kind of arbitrary premises. These are the principles of inquiry that help you as a citizen figure out where you stand with regard to the contemporary societies. Now, Kant is obviously not someone who, he had a critique of commercial societies, but that's as much as he had, and I'll say a little bit more about this tomorrow. He didn't have a fully fledged critique of capitalism or of the way in which economic and political structures interact, or what Marx later suggests of why, for example, the principles of right on which liberal, so-called liberal democratic societies are premised are constantly violated because they are under pressure from these particularistic interests. But the way he thinks about these principles and the method that it gives you is exactly the one that forces you to make the distinction between philosophy as critical inquiry on the one hand and philosophy as ideology, as a sum of opinions that you never really scrutinize and that you take for granted because you read it somewhere or because you saw it on social media or because you repeat it because someone else told you to repeat it and so on. So it's a kind of fundamental authoritarian stance, which, as I say, doesn't deliver necessarily anything concrete. And when it becomes concrete in the way in which it asks you to practice democracy as the way in which we are actually forced to ask questions about society that elaborate on these general principles. But that's also an ideal. So in a way, it's just a guidance for critical thinking, but I think a guidance that is important in times of crisis, because to be in a crisis really means to have lost the capacity to appeal to any specific theory that really helps you then overcome the problems that you're confronted with. And that's where I say, in some ways, Marxists thought that the crisis of capitalism was just material, or that it was about resources, and again, I'll say more about this tomorrow, between contradictions in modes of production and so on. But connected to those material crises, to those issues of material resource, material distribution, there is a kind of epistemic crisis. And that epistemic crisis is one that we can't really get out of without recovering something like, I think, the method of the Enlightenment as it's articulated here. And again, Kant doesn't have everything to say, but I think he's right on that.
Thank you so much for your very interesting lecture. I'm particularly interested in your understanding of the failure of the previous existing socialism before the Cold War. From your lecture, as I understand, you understand this failure as a kind of lacking of the moral dimension in this socialism. But as I understand, I think how I understand the failure of those socialists is that they had a kind of discontinuity between their moral claims and their real existing social systems or their functionality of the social life. So this kind of discontinuity can lead to both directions. On the one hand, some people become cynical and just claim that, okay, we do not need any morality. But on the other hand, the authoritarian government can, based on their moral claims, and make a huge transformation and engineering of the society, so that they create their ideal system that they believe it will work. But as a result, it didn't work very well, and that was one of the reasons that people were so disappointed of the socialist societies and looked to capitalism. And so from my understanding, I'm curious that how do you understand this functionality of the social life and social systems as an important dimension when you want to have your concept of moral socialism? I can understand and agree with you that we need to recover a moral dimension, but how do we understand? How do we recover a functionality of social life? That's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So this, in a way, is a good question because it asks me to elaborate on something that I said very, very quickly, which is when I was talking about the problematic aspects connected to what I call the immoral socialism of the 20th century, and where did the immorality of these systems consist of? And a lot of people think that. And this is something that I think has become the dominant way of thinking, actually, about the collapse of socialist societies, because it is the one that serves capitalist purposes best. Think of them as failures of economic systems. So they think, well, these were societies guided by central planning, socialization of the means of production. What is the alternative to capitalism is the socialization of the means of production. If we can show historically that this failed and these societies were made miserable, then we have ergo eliminated the alternative to capitalism. So this ideological discourse has taken hold and has become the dominant interpretation of dissidents in Eastern Europe and of the dominant explanation for the resistance that eventually matured in these societies in the 1989, 1990, and actually across the 80s leading up to it. And I think, actually, if you look at the history of the dissident movements of the 80s and 90s, in those countries where there was a dissident movement, but even if you think about the kinds of conversations that people were having, what they were complaining about, what they were arguing, the problem wasn't the collapse of the economy. The problem was the lack of agency in those societies. The fact that people didn't have a way of just telling the government what they thought, which is why in places like Albania, they resorted to placing Coca-Cola cans on their shelves because that was the only way they could signal that actually I don't like what you're doing. So it was a kind of occult, sort of hidden type of dissidence that grew out of the fact that there was no agency. And therefore, I think when I say these were immoral societies, what they lacked was laws that reflected people's voice and that could articulate, that could help them articulate their concerns and their commitments and their social critiques of their own societies. And this is really crucial because if you think about the comparison between capitalist societies and socialist societies, it's not that we don't have crises in capitalist Western societies. Someone I met a couple of weeks ago in London, someone who had just lost his job in a company. He was unemployed from one day to the other. And so, that's not worse than living in a country where actually whatever happens, you still have a job, and whatever happens, you have something at the end of the month, and you have ratio and so on, but at least nobody's actually starving. They're all poor, but no one is starving. So in terms of security, it doesn't strike me as obviously worse to know that at the end of the month you'll have something to eat as opposed to just waking up one day and realize you've been made redundant. And this was someone with a university degree, and so it's not like... But the difference is that person who has been made redundant thinks they have agency because they actually have something like elections, they choose leaders, they have a say, they criticize, they read what they like, they can say what they like to their friends, they can go on Google, they can go on social media, they can go on Facebook to say, I've lost my job, this is so horrible. And that actually makes them think, okay, so when I lose my job, maybe it's my fault a little bit, because it can't be the fault of the state since the state is channeling my preferences one way or another. And I think this is a really fundamental difference, which somehow, as I say, in the explanation of the transitions and in the interpretation of the dissident movements in Eastern Europe, which really were movements for democracy as opposed to movements against central planning or what have you, and where even the economic problems, I think, were due to lack of accountability and lack of transparency between managers and lower-level workers, or the way in which bureaucratic elites were making decisions in a way that was not taking into account of the preferences of the workers and so on. So all of these are actually concerns about the moral nature of this system and its ability to reflect what I've called freedom of agency, where in this alternative system, it's still a kind of, I think, a charade, and it's still a mask, but people have the illusion of choice. And when people don't even have the illusion of choice, then it's much easier for their criticism to take a structural form than it is for societies like ours, where you have structural oppression, but you can't really say where are the problems actually.
I take it was not for me.
What did you say? What did you say?
So I'll start again. Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. My question is maybe more or less related to the previous one. Basically, I wanted to ask this. It is about the pan you made about moral socialism being liberalism minus capitalism, which I take as half of a joke, but I can also take it seriously. And I wanted to reflect on the fact that back at school, in probably first year of the university, they had taught us that basically capitalism, that liberalism was some sort of byproduct of capitalism, or a child of capitalism, because that was what in the 17th century, 16th century, capitalism needed to thrive. And so actually freedom was primarily to be intended as freedom for money to move. And this is so true that if you look at this from the left, you could say even now that liberalism is the freedom to be poor, not to be, I don't know, treated by the public health system in the United States, because rich people must be free to choose their health insurance. So if you don't have money to pay for anything, you just can die under a bridge, and that's fine. And a byproduct of liberalism would then in turn be democracy. Then my question is, what happens really if you subtract capitalism from liberalism? Because you might end up with some kind of a void concept without any reason to exist, without any engine inside. And very interestingly, what you have before liberalism is very similar to what you have in these communist societies that we had in the 20th century, in which capitalism was subtracted, and actually you ended up, instead of ending up with some kind of a socialism, it's a good moral social relationships between people, not based on money and trade, you had extremely fixed society where little social movement was allowed, and people could not express their opinion, which I find very interesting because I find it desolating. I don't know what is actually worse. So I just wanted a more articulated point of view about that, because I find it extremely interesting and contradictory. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So when I said socialism is liberalism minus capitalism, I was actually very serious. And I'm increasingly more serious, because yesterday, for example, I met someone from the CDU who came to me and said, I'm actually convinced of this proposal that you make, and I want liberalism minus capitalism, and I'm even on board with calling it socialism. So I think it's much more politically, much more viable than you might think, because I think there are also political parties and movements in society that have an altruistic disposition as part of their ethos, as part of their ways of thinking about society that aren't, we're not surrounded by free market libertarians, even though they control most of the resources. And so where it matters, we are kind of controlled by them. But in society more broadly, I think there are very different intuitions on this. The problem, I think, with the definition of freedom that says, the freedom of choice that is apparently respected, and so this idea that you can have you have the freedom to be poor and you can choose and so on, is not just that the person who has the freedom to be poor actually doesn't really have much freedom, because being poor is not really much of a freedom. I think it's that the person who has no freedom to be poor, if you think about freedom relationally, it means that you and me, who may not have this problem, who may be rich, are actually also not safe in a society like that. Because poverty creates all sorts of social implications and repercussions. And so you have issues of security, you have issues of anomie, of pathologies that emerge out of poverty. And so these aren't the problems just of the individual who is confronting the question of what do I do tomorrow if I haven't got a job, or if I haven't got food, or if I can't if I can't pay my rent and someone is going to evict me, I haven't got a house. These aren't just the problems of the person who confronts them, they're actually the problems of the person who also has to live in that society with the person who confronts them. And this is something that we see every now and then. So during COVID, it was very obvious, for example, in the eyes of everyone, that you can't think of freedom as just the freedom of the individual, that you have to think of freedom as a social relation, and that was indeed the discourse that was driving the importance of vaccines and thinking about the health of others' concerns. So there are moments of crisis where this becomes intuitively very clear that you can't think of freedom in this way, and you need to have a different understanding of how social relations operate and what society needs to actually make everyone flourish, and how everyone flourishing is actually in the interest of the individuals, not just in the name of some kind of general collective interest that society promotes. However, the difficulty is that, as I say, in capitalist societies, the ways in which we normalize the idea that individuals are responsible, individuals face the plight, they had a choice, they made the choice, and now they have to consider the responsibility. This was exactly what was missing in communist countries. It was exactly this idea that individual has any choice and any say on anything. So the state provides for everything. The one thing it does, and so it's like a benevolent dictatorship, you kind of get, if you're not a dissident, if you're someone who didn't have reason, like my grandfather, to go to prison because he was actually also arguing intellectually, your very basic needs might be taken care of, but you have no agency. And that lack of agency, structurally and systematically, is more pernicious than this other lack of agency, which someone can normalize by telling them a story about how they're actually responsible.
Thank you. So we have 10 more minutes, and I think we are just going to collect the last round of questions. So it's your turn.
My question is about how we should be thinking about this Weltbegriff of philosophy, because at least the way I understand Kant, what we know is preconditioned by these certain a priori categories, and this constitutes Erfahrung, experience. Is it that we should think our current experiences differently under capitalist or socialist conditions? Or is it thinking in a way that's perhaps more faithful to the Kantian principles? So I guess the question is it a difference of degree or quality when we're trying to mobilize this Weltbegriff?
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question would be, why do you opt for moral rather than, for example, ethical socialism? And if you could spell out better the difference between ethics, morals, and ideology. Thank you.
So I'm completely convinced by the kind of strict genealogy of the Enlightenment and of socialist thinking. I think socialism is basically just the continuation of the Enlightenment. But there are, of course, also points of contention between Marx and Kant. And I think the Trotsky article you mentioned hints to that. So if we follow a strict deontological ethics like Kant wants us to, then we can't do the revolution. I mean, if the law says don't do the revolution, then we have to abide. And I think socialism, at least before the revolution, needs to have a consequentialist ethics. So everything that leads us to socialism is good, everything that doesn't is bad. And this is how I think, we have to judge this. Consequentialism with utopia, like with the ideal society. So how do you square this?
Okay, so one last question, and then we have to...
Okay. Hi. So if you subtract capitalism from liberalism, this obviously raises the question, like, what is left? And the answer you gave today is, if I got you right, is like agency, critical thinking, and somewhat like the inheritance of the Enlightenment. But I was wondering, what about the state and the rule of law? Particularly, I'm wondering about this question because you emphasized that the problem about the so-called real existing socialism was the lack of agency. And that very much sounded to me that like what was lacking was like kind of a like individual rights that would allow people to have like the kind of space where they can just do whatever they want without like anybody telling them what to do, may it be moral or not. So that would be a way of endorsing that's kind of lacking agency as well. But then we would have to talk of like kind of legal socialism and maybe not moral socialism.
Okay, maybe I'll take them in reverse order because is that okay? Because I remember them better. So I think moral socialism has, as you will see tomorrow and Friday, I think is as much anti-state as it is anti-capitalism, because there is this cosmopolitanism that runs through it, which says that the state is just a vehicle for realizing certain principles, but the vehicle is just that, it's a vehicle. And this is actually where the difference is between, as I said earlier, Kant and Hegel, where you think of the state as something more than just a vehicle. At most, for Kant, it's a kind of approximation. It's a better tool, or it's there is a more incremental story, but nothing really happens qualitatively with the state. It's just what we need to go by when we think about rights and law and legal representation, which is, again, not to say that it doesn't matter, and therefore the proposal is not an anarchist proposal, because it's not saying, well, the state, therefore let's just get rid of the state and let's start from wherever we can. There's something the process brings into it that makes it not completely arbitrary and useful for political purposes, but you don't hang on to it. And indeed, I think at this level of thinking about globalization and global thinking, in many ways, I think the state, in particular, in connection to developments of social democracy, has really become an obstacle, because the left can't think beyond the state. They think all they need to do is somehow find an increased representation, and it's not really their job what happens beyond the state, and so then you have this international realm that's just left to its own devices. Revolution and consequentialism. Well, I don't think you would have said these things about consequentialism if you were a socialist in a prison camp in Albania. Because I think, and this is where, again, the proposal is really deontological in many ways, you can't just say that in the name of this ideal that we want to realize, whatever takes us to the ideal, it's fine. The whole point of this Kantian way of thinking and of the moral in the socialist project is to say that there must be constraints of reason that also become part of the process, and that therefore not any socialism that takes you faster, also because it actually doesn't take you faster. Think about the collapse of socialism. So you think for one generation that you can get there faster by just pursuing the goal, and then in the next couple of generations it doesn't work on its own terms because you've just lost everything you had, and it takes another 200 years to revive the discussion on what it means to be a socialist and why we should care about socialism, and so on. And the other thing to say, and I'll say a lot more about this in the third lecture, is that when we think about revolution, we mustn't think just about political revolutions. There is something about revolution in thought, which is actually what this Kantian Weltbegriff, where it's going in terms of thinking about how do we transform our attitudes and how can we change societies such that individuals' attitudes to each other, to their social relations, can be motivated by moral principles as opposed by the kinds of things that they are motivated by now. So I don't think we should restrict revolution to just legal change or legal revolutions, although they're really important. There is a way of thinking about revolution which means that you might be able to preserve a revolutionary way of thinking even in times of great reaction. And actually, I think this is what we need right now, is exactly to recover revolutionary thinking, which doesn't necessarily mean that tomorrow we go up and blow the Reichstag up or whatever, but that kind of encourages critical thinking. Okay, what is some morality, ethics, and ideology? I think of ethics as a type of social morality, and I think of ideology as ethics gone wrong. That's just the kind of quick slogan, which you can take away and come back tomorrow. And then an experience. I don't think there is something like at the cognitive level, something like a socialist experience or a capitalist experience, because I think what Kant wants to say, and again I agree with him, is that some fundamental capacities are there regardless of what ideological structures, and indeed even regardless of what ethical structures do to you. There is something about the human and the way in which we process information about both thought and action that isn't reducible to the particular ideological circumstances or religious circumstances or whatever. And so I think that freedom of agency that is really central to this way of thinking about socialism and will be really central tomorrow. Freedom of agency is everywhere and everyone has it, even in Iran, even in Afghanistan, that just does not go, and there's no society that can ever take that away from anyone. And I will die on that hill.
Okay, so now you have got a lot of take-home messages and some things to think about until tomorrow, and we're in the lucky position to continue the discussion, continue the elaboration of what moral socialism is tomorrow, 6 o'clock, same place. And thank you again so much for everything.
Thank you.